No matter how much your tastes have evolved from the time you were eating school lunches and everything with ketchup, Velveeta probably has a special place in your list of guilty pleasures. It might be one of the most unnatural colors you'll see in the supermarket, and it might be of a completely questionable texture, but there's no denying that magic happens when you melt it. Few things in gaming are as bittersweet as reminiscing about your favorite MMOs that are no longer around. You can always pick up an old single-player game, and the same is true for most multiplayer games provided their developers haven't shut down the master server or the community hasn't dwindled away. What's the deal with this super processed but super popular cheese product? Velveeta was created as a way to reuse extra cheese. Velveeta wasn't so much discovered as it was invented, and even stranger is the fact that it's actually the second cheese invented by Swiss immigrant Emil Frey. But MMOs? Those tend to just disappear into the ether once shut down. It can be pretty heart-wrenching, especially if you're still firmly part of the community when it happens. Still, it's fun to remember the good times, so let's take a look back at some of the best, now shut down, MMOs of all time. Number 5, Tabula Rasa. Tabula Rasa didn't affect me as deeply as my experiences in other MMOs, but it will always be memorable to me as a unique experience in a genre full of Me Too games. Richard Garriott had some novel ideas for the game, combining elements of a shooter with RPG combat in an MMO. Frey emigrated to the US with his father, who was also a farmer and cheese maker, and eventually ended up working for the Monroe Cheese Company in New York. First, he was tasked with creating a cheese that could be used in lieu of an imported cheese called Bismarck, and he did. His first cheese was the soft, spreadable, and amazing Leiterskranz, and it was so popular the factory was shipping out more than a ton of cheese a day just to keep up with demand. That was in 1889, and it wasn't until 1918 that he discovered his second famous cheese. At the time, the company had opened another location that mainly produced Swiss cheese. They had a problem, though. It was difficult to sell cheese wheels that were damaged, and that was a lot of product they didn't want to go to waste. It was somewhat clunky in execution, but overall, I enjoyed it. Knowing Frey had already had success creating new cheeses, they sent him some samples and asked him to come up with a product that used these cheese scraps. After some serious experimentation, most of which was done on his own home stove, he came up with a product that not only used all the cheese scraps that might have otherwise gone to waste, but he also produced a cheese with a texture unlike any other. What made the game truly stand out to me at the time though was the dynamic feel of the game world. It was the texture, described as velvety, that he named Velveeta for. This cheese product was invented with weird science. Frey's experience didn't just lead him to a way to use cheese that would otherwise be thrown away, but it also led him to some weird science. MMOs were, and still are, often very static, but Tabula Rasa's world felt alive. The way enemies spawned in via dropships and the fact that NPC outposts could be attacked and taken over by invading NPC forces really spiced up the experience. The game's final update was bittersweet, as it introduced pilotable mechs to the game shortly before it was set to be shut down. Melt most real cheese and you'll end up separating the oil from it in something of, to use the technical term, a yucky mess. Melt Velveeta, though, and you'll get an amazing guilty pleasure that's perfect for things like queso. It's all complicated science, but basically, what's going on with real cheese when you heat it is the creation of a state where caseins, the proteins in milk, don't mix with water. While that's what makes cheese, well, cheese, it's also what makes the fat separate from most cheeses when you melt it. Frey was following in the footsteps of two men named Fritz Settler and Walter Gerber, Swiss researchers who were trying to find a cheese product that would melt. Fans of the game who were already upset that the game was cancelled too soon were essentially teased by what could have been if the game had the chance to realize its potential. Number 4, The Matrix Online. I already know I am going to be in the minority here, and that's okay. Mmos' interlock combat system, while flawed, was unique to the genre and was an excellent way for the developers at Monolith to convey Matrix-style combat in a genre that still wasn't ready for action combat due to technical limitations at the time. Beyond that, The Matrix Online was a roleplayer's dream. When they added sodium citrate to their cheesy experiments, they found they could melt cheese and reform it into the familiar, Velveeta-shaped block.
That's because the sodium citrate changes the state of those caseins, and allows them to form something much more soluble and resistant to heat. Monolith's live events team was a compelling way to get players involved in the game's ongoing storyline. Kraft actually describes it as reversing the process that made cheese in the first place, then stopping at a point before it breaks down completely. It got a major boost in popularity during the Depression and World War II. From the 1920s to the 1940s, the U.S. went from the Great Depression right into World War II. And that was on the heels of the First World War. Velveeta, and Kraft's mac and cheese, got a massive popularity boost at the time because its affordability allowed families to stretch their pennies even farther and still keep food on the table. During the Depression, an average family's food budget for the week was somewhere around $9, although many were forced to make do with even less than that. The game's story would progress from month to month, partially shaped by players' actions, and the game world would visually change to reflect whatever was going on in said storyline. The aforementioned live events team had Monolith staff play the part of various iconic Matrix characters and interact with players to help drive that storyline forward. So, when families were faced with feeding 4, 5, or more people on pennies a day, getting growing kids all the nutrition they needed was of the utmost importance. Milk was expensive, but Velveeta was not. By the time World War II started, milk and cheddar cheese were among the first items to be rationed on the home front. It's not every day that you get to join together with the top leaders of your faction for a secret underground meeting with a character like Niobe. While supplying the troops was first priority, keeping everyone at home healthy and strong was a close second, and Kraft's wartime campaign made it clear that Velveeta was an affordable, healthy way to make sure your entire family got all the goodness they needed to pull their weight and get things done. Or rush to Morpheus' aid as he's assailed by the machines and machine-aligned players, escorting him up the stairs through a skyscraper in a dramatic rooftop escape. Active players were sometimes given a nod in future quests, too. For example, My Guild, Archimedes' Lever, was eventually written into the game's canon with a small mention in one of the main story quests. It was an unexpected but enjoyable surprise that helped cement that feeling of being connected to the game's world. Number 3 Warhammer Online launched a disaster. As a bonus, Velveeta was also marketed as a way to make those leftovers into something the family wanted to eat, and make it easier to guarantee nothing went to waste. The only reason I don't remember its launch worse than I do now is because even as bad as things were, it paled in comparison to the true disaster that was Age of Conan only a couple of months earlier. Velveeta was affordable, healthy, and firmly cemented into popular culture as the stuff of fighting the good fight. It was advertised as a super healthy, nutritious option. Each 1-pound brick of Velveeta has a recommended 16 servings, and if you look at the nutritional information through 21st century eyes, those servings are pretty terrifying. Each serving has 80 calories, 50 from fat, 6 grams of fat, 4 from saturated fat, and 3 grams of carbs, with 2 that come from sugars. Despite all the issues, War was still a compelling experience as a follow-up to Mythic's Dark Age of Camelot. There's a ton of sodium, too, 410 mg, and you're only getting 15% of your daily dose of calcium. That means Velveeta is a guilty pleasure today, and that all makes it even more surprising that it wasn't just marketed as an affordable way to feed a family, but as a super healthy way to feed them, too. Velveeta was a 1930s-era superfood, on paper, at least. DAOC players understandably found the game's RVR lacking in comparison, but for someone who had never played DAOC, War left a lasting impact on me. That's literal, as the American Medical Association declared Velveeta was chock full of super nutritious goodness. I don't think I ever really cared about PvP until I experienced the realm pride of playing for the Order faction. That was in 1931, and from there was no looking back. Flawed as it was, the RVR campaign was still a whole lot of fun. Eventually getting to the point where we had the opportunity to capture the enemy capital and kick players out of their city was completely worth it. The victory lap of running through the city, tearing it down, and looting it made winning the campaign that much sweeter. Of course, players whined about having actual consequence to the campaign, and Mythic dialed things back, but that wasn't the true shame of War. Over time, Mythic slowly improved Warhammer Online by adding new content, stomping out bugs, and most importantly, refining the RVR experience. What was bizarre to me was EA's business approach to the game. Surveys done in the 1930s even found that about 2/3 of Americans liked cheese product better than actual cheese, and there was no reason for them to believe it was anything but as healthy as it was good. There were university studies done, too, with Rutgers University confirming the AMA's belief that Velveeta included everything needed for firm flesh. Vintage Velveeta recipes are just bizarre craft wanted to give housewives all the tools they needed to make dinner taste good, aside from their cheese, of course. War hemorrhaged most of its player base even as Mythic chugged along improving things, but EA never really full-heartedly tried to rescue it on the business side. Free-to-play was just starting to really become a thing in the West, and yet EA's tepid response was to only allow players to play the 1-10 experience for free, instead of going in all the way as it did with Star Wars: The Old Republic. They put out a whole bunch of recipes to help families get the most out of Velveeta and keep everyone from getting tired of the same, boring old grilled cheese sandwiches. That's admirable enough, but some of the ideas were just downright bizarre. If you were looking for something to serve at a party, you might have come across Kraft's suggestion for Hawaiian-inspired party foods, and you can make them right now. Just take half of a toasted bun, apply a generous layer of peanut butter, add a slice of pineapple, a slice of Velveeta, then leave in the oven enough to melt the cheese. Top with a maraschino cherry, and you had the makings of a party platter that was sure to delight. Velveeta was good for breakfast, too, and a Velveeta jelly omelette might have been the perfect way to start your day off right. It came as no surprise to me that war eventually shut down. There just wasn't any will within EA to truly attempt to save it. Number 2 City of Heroes. Paragon Studios came out of nowhere in 2004 with an MMO that wasn't only novel in its theme, but completely unique to the genre in its gameplay. In City of Heroes, players could create their own characters utilizing the most expansive character creator in gaming and live out their fantasies of just about any comic book character archetype they fancied. For 2004, the combat was action-packed with awe-inspiring visual effects. Most of this recipe doesn't sound too bad, and it's basically a 4-egg omelette with Velveeta folded into the eggs. Where it starts to get a little sketchy is with Kraft's suggestion to top it with your favorite jelly. They recommend the tart kind, and some parsley, because why not? There's also offerings like the Velveeta Strata, which was basically a casserole made from a bread layer, a Velveeta layer, another bread layer, then a slather of eggs and milk. Paragon Studios continued to push the technological envelope with the game over the years, incorporating Phys-X effects to really enhance feel of powers and add a level of destructibility to the world, particularly in Mayhem Safeguard missions. Also to be served with jelly. There were Velveeta pizzas, an olive macaroni and cheese casserole, and a Velveeta dish from the family gatherings of the glamorous housewife. That recipe came from memories of years of holiday dinners, and it was literally only pearl onions melted in Velveeta cheese, and according to her, it tastes exactly as good as it sounds. It's the backbone of a presidential tradition. Not all Velveeta recipes are questionable to modern tastes, and if you still use a brick of Velveeta to whip up some queso dip on every occasion you can rationally come up with, you're in good company. Before, during, and after his presidency, Lyndon B. only in COH could my character explode into a fiery nova and launch gangsters down city blocks every which way. Between the awesome combat and huge variety in character possibilities, it was one of the few MMOs to hold my interests for years and years at a time. Number 1 Star Wars Galaxies. Like Ultima Online, Star Wars Galaxies realized the promise of what MMOs could be: living, breathing, virtual worlds, where players could be and do just about whatever they wanted. Johnson never stopped being a Texan, and huge barbecues in his hometown of Stonewall were a regular occurrence. For me, this is what I always wanted from the genre, but it was a double win in that it all went down in a Star Wars universe. As a fan of the expanded universe, there was always more to Star Wars to me than the notion of being a Jedi and swinging a lightsaber. Velveeta was always on the menu, in the form of a queso dip made with Rotel tomatoes. It was such a hit that it even made it into an official cookbook, one assembled by the San Antonio Symphony League. Lady Bird Johnson contributed it in 1976, and her version called for half a pound of cheese and half a can of tomatoes, melted together and served in the familiar way as a dip on corn chips. The EU authors built a vast Star Wars universe in their many works, and SWG truly capitalized on tapping into all that Star Wars lore that existed outside of the films. The breadth and depth of gameplay options ranged from being a politician managing a player city, to creating awesome creatures as a bioengineer, to bounty hunting, and even taking to space as a starfighter pilot. SWG truly had everything. The interdependence between players combined with the vast size of the game's many worlds promised endless adventure and fostered interaction between players. I won't soon forget the lasting relationship I built with a pair of armor and weaponsmiths who provided me with gear early in my travels and later on asked me to help them get their harvesters to dangerous spots on worlds like Dathomir in exchange for free or discounted services. I fondly remember going on a massive newbie raid on Endor with a bunch of other players. She also said the cheesy tomato mix was good as a spread on crackers or toast, and that it could also be used as a filling for hard-boiled eggs or as a dip for celery. The traditions continued, and Texas-inspired galas continue to feature Velveeta on the menu. In 2005, the chairman of the Black Tie and Boots inaugural ball published his list of ingredients to a successful gathering. And who could forget the attempts to conquer Ft. Tuscan? Stopping to camp to lick our wounds and regroup, joke around, and play music offered much-needed pauses between high moments of action or frustrating bouts of defeat. Third on the list after chips and salsa was 300 pounds of Velveeta. We're eating more and more of it all the time. The internet might make us think we're being more health conscious all the time, but there's a big difference between what we see and post on the internet and real life. In 2014, the steadily climbing consumption of Velveeta led to a shortage that the internet quickly dubbed cheesepocalypse. It also gave players a chance to learn more about the people they were fighting beside, and really build the bonds of community that are a unique strength of the MMO genre. Michael began his career at the Warcry network in 2005 as the site manager for several different Warcry fansite portals. In 2008, Michael worked for the startup magazine Massive Gamer as a columnist and online news editor. In June of 2009, Michael joined MMORPG.com as the site's community manager. Follow him on Twitter at @eMikeB. Just what happened to cause the shortage wasn't entirely specified by Kraft, but according to Bloomberg, it likely has something to do with the increasing popularity of this processed cheese food. Between 2013 and 2014 alone, sales of Velveeta increased by 23.7%, while brand sales rose by 16.3%. The trend continued in 2015, for a terrible reason. When Kraft crunched the numbers, they found that a large percentage of their sales were driven by outlets like Family Dollar. That's because an ever-increasing percentage of the population who find themselves living on an increasingly tight budget is turning to dollar and discount stores to get the basics at a fraction of the price. As baby boomers adapt to life on a fixed pension, they're also heading to dollar stores to pick up essentials, and that includes the Velveeta they remember from their childhoods. Velveeta is more upsetting to lactose-intolerant people than many real cheeses. It's not easy being lactose intolerant. Since dairy is right out, that means cheese is too, but Velveeta isn't technically cheese, so that should be acceptable, right? Not so fast. For the estimated 65% of the world's population that has some sort of difficulty with eating lactose, there's certain kinds of cheeses that many can tolerate, think aged cheeses like Parmesan, but Velveeta is absolutely intolerable to most. When it comes to what a lactose-intolerant person can actually eat, some people are fine with tiny amounts of lactose. Parmesan, for example, contains less than 3% lactose, and other low-lactose cheeses, like Camembert and Munster, contain less than 2%. While lactose content in some more naturally formed cheese can vary, the regular process that makes Velveeta means that we know exactly how much lactose is going to be in it, and it's a whopping 9.3%. Needless to say, that takes it right off a lot of tables. You can make it at home. There's a lot about Velveeta to love. But even if you love it, you might find it hard to serve with the nutritional information that makes it cheese product instead of actual cheese, and that's why some people have gone above and beyond to figure out just how you can make it right in your own kitchen.
Wired kitchen wizards have figured out how to recreate Velveeta using a handful of other types of cheeses and ingredients like white wine, kosher salt, and that sodium citrate that's pretty much responsible for making Velveeta the smooth, creamy cheese it is. If you don't happen to have sodium citrate on hand, the brown-eyed baker has another version of homemade Velveeta that you can make in a loaf pan and slice up, and melt, just like the real thing. This one calls for a base of cheddar cheese, some dry milk powder, and unflavored gelatin. Now, you can make all the queso you want and know exactly what went into making it. There's been fan fiction written about it. How much do you love Velveeta? Do you really, really love it? Do you love it enough to write fan fiction about it? Fan fiction is a strange sort of phenomenon, and most of it's written about favorite movies or television shows. It turns out all you really need is massive fans, though, and Velveeta has that. There's this oddly wonderful piece of fan fiction called The Velveeta Rabbit, and it tells the story of the journey of a rabbit who has been formed from a block of Velveeta. That's not all there is, and some enterprising fan fic writers have managed to combine Velveeta with everything from Dragon Ball Z to Harry Potter. It's shown up in Avengers fanfiction, too, proving that absolutely everyone loves this oddly colored, orange cheese product, even, apparently, superheroes.